Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and corruption. I'm your host, Zevon Odelberg, and we have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. Well, hi there, writes Aimie Seren. I found your podcast just last week via British Murders, and I gotta say I'm hooked. I feel like I learned lots of American history and cool facts while also getting my true crime fix. I love the humor that you managed to fit in, as well as your sympathetic viewpoint on many topics. Well, thanks, Aimie. She goes on. I'm writing because you always offer for us to get in touch if we're going through a rough patch or just want to tell our story to someone. I guess it's a little bit of both for me. I feel like I've already been through the roughest parts of my story, but as I'm sure you know, now is the time that I get to process, understand, and grieve. I'm going to try to write leaving out a few of the more telling personal details so that you'll be able to share this on the podcast if you see fit. I feel like there are some people, more people than we might imagine, who can identify with my tale, so maybe this can help someone. And that's how listener Aimie Seren's email began. Now, as you know, on virtually every episode of Kinda Murdery, I encourage everyone to share their unique life stories or the unique challenges that they face by reaching out to me at kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on all social media. Of course, you're welcome to share privately, but I'll admit that I'm always hoping you'll be okay with sharing your story with the community because, as I often say, it's my even greater hope that by sharing our stories, we can all become a little more real to each other, that we can learn to recognize the common humanity even of those people who live very different lives than our own, and that we can build community, understanding, and empathy that way. That hopefully we can all learn to be a little more patient and compassionate. And I'll be the first to tell you that patience and even compassion are not always innate virtues for me. So this exercise of sharing our life experiences is as much for my benefit as it is for yours, which brings me to our story today. Today we have our very first of what I hope will be many listener story episodes, and it's an incredible story. The story of listener Aimie Seren. I have to tell you, she sent me this story in an email, the opening of that email you heard a moment ago, and the email itself knocked my socks off. And because Aimie has given me her permission, and even more because I find her story utterly compelling, and also just about the perfect length for an episode of Kinda Murdery, I've decided to do exactly what the name of this episode implies and give Aimie her very own episode. It's an episode entitled Christian Cowboy Cults, the Forbes 500, and Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy, the incredible true life story of listener Aimie Seren. Now, I know that Aimie hopes that her story will help to inspire strength for others who are facing the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and I hope that too. I also hope that Amy's story inspires you to share your own story, and that listener stories can become a regular part of Kinda Murdery. And of course, again, if you would like to share your story, if Aimie inspires you to share your story, please do reach out to me at kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on all social media. And by the way, if you don't like getting inspired, if you hate people telling you how uplifting or moving something is going to be, and sometimes, honestly, I hate that too, then rest assured that you can set aside all feelings of emotional triumph, kinship, upliftingness, or whatever else it is that you find annoying. You can ignore all that stuff in this story, and it's still a great Kinda Murdery story. So if you're like, shut up about community, shut up about compassion, shut up about understanding and empathy, I've had enough of that crap, then don't worry. You're still going to like this story. But if you believe in understanding community, empathy, and compassion, you might like it even more. And so, if you're ready, I suggest that you put your personal items underneath the seat in front of you. Stow your carry-on in the overhead compartment. Let go of the worries of the day. But be sure your seatbelt is fastened. There's turbulence expected ahead. Kinda Murdery's Christian Cowboy Cults, the Forbes 500, and Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy, the incredible true life story of listener Aimie Seren, starts now. I was born in small-town Mississippi. We were poor. My dad was a mechanic and a tennis instructor, and my mom was a child of wealth who threw it all away to be with my dad. There were 5 of us kids, and we all agree that those years in Mississippi were our happiest. When I was 6, we moved to Texas because my cousin had married the daughter of a guy on the Forbes 500 list, and their wedding gift was an 8,000-acre ranch. My dad was hired as ranch manager, and we were gifted a house and vehicles. Soon, my uncle, that's my recently wealthy cousin's dad, also moved to the ranch. He was also gifted a house and eventually land and money to build a church. This uncle happened to be a religious fanatic of the worst sort, evangelical to the max, but not at all the mainstream kind. According to him, women were to submit to men completely as if men were God himself. We were required to wear clothes, obscuring every beautiful part of the female figure, and we were not allowed to have opinions that differed from that of the male-led group. Of course, it would have been unthinkable for a woman to speak out in church or assume any position of leadership. All females were expected to stay home, barefoot and pregnant, so to speak. Children were a blessing from the Lord, and the more the better, and birth control of any sort was spoken of as a form of murder. My parents told me it wasn't important for me to study since my role would be caring for a home and children while my future husband did all the providing and thinking. So, that was my life until I was about 18. I went through phases of extreme devotion to this ideology, preparing myself to be the ideal submissive mother and wife, and fighting off any fleshly desires or evil rebellion that happened to crop up. I read the Bible cover to cover about 8 times and memorized long passages. I was viewed as a devoted daughter and a holy follower of the church led by my uncle, which was of course filled with like-minded families. When I was almost 18, it was discovered that my goody two-shoes cousin had been cheating on his wife of 13 years. It also came out that he'd been embezzling from his father-in-law, the guy on the Forbes 500 list, and worst of all, he was a child molester and a pervert of all sorts, and on top of that, it appears that my uncle, who led our church, had known about all of this and covered it up in order to continue receiving the benefits that the family got from their connection to extreme wealth. Wow, that's awful. Now, I've never had any reason to believe that my parents were involved in this cover-up, but who's to say? As a result of these discoveries, my cousin was summarily divorced by his wife. Her whole family immediately hired bodyguards. It turns out that my cousin had also made covert attempts on his wife's life, and we, all being from the cousin's side of the family, were asked to leave. This put us in a bit of a pickle, to say the least. My dad was in his mid-60s at this point and already suffering the early effects of Alzheimer's disease. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, Amy. Leaving an environment that had been so familiar to him was a drastic blow, and his emotional health also suffered, as he suddenly had no way to be the provider that, quote, God, unquote, said he should be. Fortunately, one of the families in the church offered us their home to live in. They were away on business for a year. Then, after that, another church family offered us an apartment to live in for drastically reduced rent. Through all of this, I was thrown into the role of primary caregiver for my parents and younger siblings. My mom was absorbed into caring for my dad, my older brothers had careers and lived a couple hours away, and I was the one left holding everything in my young, shy, ignorant, sheltered girl hands. Gosh, Amy, that sounds really hard. Initially, I taught tennis with my dad, but he'd lost the mental and physical abilities to do the job, and it brought little money. After that, he kind of gave up on life, and I got a job as a waitress. A waitressing job may sound simple to many, but for me, it was an incredibly overwhelming experience. Having lived so isolated for most of my life, and only having interacted with people who were exactly in line with the church's way of thinking, this was a change I was not prepared for. I felt like everybody around me was speaking a language I didn't understand, and it took all the bravery I could muster just to greet new people. My first job was at a diner, everything you might expect in small-town Texas, and the waitresses were at once the scariest and most loving people I had ever known. Once they realized where I was coming from, they cared for me like mother hens. And soon the boss started calling me Queen Bee because of my quality of work and charming manner with clients. I couldn't tell you how I adapted so fast, but I did, and after a time at that job, I got an offer from a swanky bistro on Main Street, so I went there. Now this was truly my introduction to the, quote, real world, unquote. This place was owned by a gay couple that hosted parties that lasted until the wee hours of the morning. They loved and appreciated every expression of beauty, including but not limited to that of the human body. I was still as ignorant as ever, but I was getting exposed to new things and learning to dress myself in a way that actually felt cute and modern. No more floor-length skirts. My collarbone was free at last. My pants actually fit. And most important of all were my bosses. 2 gay men that treated me like their daughter, fawning over me when I got new clothes, supporting my dreams, making sure I was okay, and giving me a hug when my parents showed up at work to, quote, check on me, unquote. It was during this time that I finally worked up the courage to tell my parents that I wouldn't be attending church with them anymore. It was a blow to them, but not entirely unexpected at this point, and we adjusted together slowly. I was still living with them, paying half of their rent, buying most of the groceries and insurance and gas for their vehicle that I used to get to work. Eventually, I saved enough to buy my own vehicle and moved out into an apartment owned by my bosses. I began dating my friend's dad, a man 20 years my senior, who'd been a friend and a listening ear during the past 2 years of adjustment and discovery. He was 40, but was incredibly attractive, very fit, and we could talk for hours. He was everything that was the opposite of the men that I grew up around. He was an atheist, a feminist, a philosopher, and a stickler for personal freedom. After we'd been dating for 3 months, I found out I was pregnant. I was underweight, working too much, and quickly became very sick from my pregnancy. Without telling my family, I gave up my job and apartment, much to the disappointment and concern of my bosses, and moved in with H, my baby's father. He took great care of me, cutting his hours at work to be with me and making all of my meals, finding me a midwife and driving me to all of my appointments. He also accompanied me through the difficult task of telling my family about our relationship and baby, which was the beginning of what would be a permanent rift. My parents were blown away that I had chosen a mate without their approval and had a baby out of wedlock. It was more than scandalous, it was sinful. Their pain and fear vented itself as horror and outrage, and unfortunately mine did too. Our relationship was hot and cold over the next 2 years, and ultimately I felt it necessary to cut off everyone except my younger brother. All but one other brother had participated in the church's shunning of me. My mother, on orders from my uncle the pastor, had mounted a massive gossip campaign against me, and in general I felt a huge lack of respect for my choices as an adult. My daughter was born when I was barely 21, and she was healthy and more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. In 2015, H and I made the decision to move away from the small town where all this trauma had happened. We took a big swing and moved to Chile. Along with us were H's daughter, our daughter, my brother-in-law, father-in-law, and H's business partner. And this is where my story gets kinda murdery. We left the blistering heat of July summer in Texas and arrived in Chile to the dead of winter in the southern hemisphere. All 7 of us moved into one house initially. Then soon thereafter, 5 of us stayed, and my father-in-law and brother-in-law moved into an adjacent cabin. On top of the obvious stress of living in close quarters with people who had been accustomed to their own space, we all began to get sick quite frequently. At first, we attributed it to the sudden change of climate, but it continued after we should have been adjusted to this, and H, who had always been so healthy and strong, was soon a shadow of his former self. He was skinny and weak and constantly tired. We thought it was just stress, and though we went to doctors a couple of times, they didn't have much more of a clue than we did. We tried to eat better and rest more, but there wasn't much change, just adapting to a new normal of not wellness. Once again, I was thrown into the role of primary caregiver for everyone. I cooked, I cleaned, I took care of the kids. I handled most of the business and tried to care for H the best I knew how. This was also when H's problems with alcohol began, which was strange since he'd always been able to quit at will. But after arriving in Chile and living in the house with the group, he lost the capacity to control his intake. He tried to quit many times, but would be overcome by tremors and shakes and cravings that he'd never struggled with before. Finally, 2 years later, we finished building our own home and moved in, H and I and our little girl. At last we were healthy for a while, and we soon welcomed the baby boy I had always wanted. Fast forward 5 years after moving to Chile, 2020, the notorious pandemic year. We'd settled into our home and developed a farmstead. I had rabbits, ducks, geese, and my beloved milk goats. I was constantly frustrated because despite my doting care of the animals, they were always sick with strange ailments, and many of them would die, even with my desperate efforts to save them. Finally, we reached a breaking point after we returned from a weekend away to find all of the rabbits mysteriously dead and several of our belongings vandalized. Wow, this really is getting kinda murdery. We installed security cameras and set to watching the resulting videos regularly. I should mention at this point that H's business partner, a lady in her 70s that we had cared for as family for years, was now our next-door neighbor. We had always thought that she had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but assumed that it was confined to her pet dogs. We suspected that she made them sick in order to find cures for them, a pattern we'd seen repeated for years. Zevon jumping in here for just a moment. My gosh, this is A, ominous, but also B, just wanted to clarify in case anyone was still a little bit unclear. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is a form of child abuse. It's a mental illness where the child's caretaker, usually the mother, will either make up the symptoms for illness or actually cause the real symptoms in order to make the child look sick. In this case, this would be Munchausen syndrome by proxy, but apparently applied to the neighbor's pets. Alright, back to Amy's story. In watching the security tapes, we began to find this woman, E, doing very strange things during the night and while we were gone. She would walk slowly around the property and pause intermittently, fiddling with her pockets and then dropping things we couldn't see. After she made these mysterious trips, the animals would congregate around where she had paused and appear to be eating something off the ground. Then, ailments would strike the animals. Our dogs would have diarrhea. The goats would begin to act listless or stop eating. One night, I purposely stationed 2 goats in a pen in front of her house, in full view of the security cameras. I know it sounds cruel, but we needed to be certain of the truth. Sure enough, she made one of her trips out to the goats during the night. Within 24 hours, both goats had succumbed to another strange illness and died. At this point, we were sure she was poisoning our animals. Golly, this gives me the absolute heebie-jeebies. Alright, sorry for the interruption, back to the story. We made the decision to move her off of our property. The pandemic had just begun, so it was easy to convince her that she needed to live in town, closer to her doctors and food delivery services. We kept her one remaining dog so as not to subject him to any more suffering, and packed her off to an apartment in the city where she wouldn't have contact with any other innocent animals. We thought our troubles were over, but we soon realized that the animals weren't her only victims. On her way out, she'd given a bottle of vodka to H as her parting gift. Since this was his weakness, and at this point we only suspected her for poisoning the animals, he began drinking it. I returned from a trip to the city to find him collapsed on the floor, bleeding from his nose and mouth and anywhere else you can bleed from. Oh my God. At this point, having studied medicine on my own for years, I knew enough to save him and get him well without assistance. It seems relevant here to let you know that H was extremely paranoid of doctors and hospitals, so he wouldn't have accepted outside help. It was up to me to care for him alone. I seem to keep finding myself in this position. I had also become ill earlier that same day when I went to her new apartment to check on her and drank a glass of water she'd offered me. Oh my God, this is so creepy. Kinda murdery indeed. This is when it finally clicked for us that E had been behind all of our illnesses over the last 5 years. She wasn't just poisoning the animals, she'd been poisoning us. Yes, H was an alcoholic by this time, but through research we realized that she'd not only laced his vodka with rat poison, but also with many other medications, which we knew she'd been stockpiling. There were addictive opiate painkillers and ACE inhibitors. There was no way to prove anything since the medications were prescribed to her, and H had dumped what remained of the vodka in a terrified attempt to keep himself from drinking more. We had no way of knowing how many things she'd poisoned us with over the years, since she'd lived with us for a while, and afterwards, when she became our neighbor, we always left the doors unlocked. South American law enforcement is notoriously lenient with their senior citizens, so we felt hopeless and, in our weakened conditions, overwhelmed by the prospect of trying to build a case against her. Anyway, she was finally far away and no longer had access to us. Neither of us went to visit her again, instead sending what she needed by delivery service, and warning the delivery men not to consume anything she offered. Since she didn't speak Spanish, she would have no contact with her neighbors. Oh my gosh, this is so heavy. For the next 2 years, we immersed ourselves in recovery of all sorts. The pandemic made it easy for us to get lost in farm work and focus on ourselves. We all improved drastically, but H never stopped drinking. Then, a year and a half ago, my father-in-law suddenly died of a heart attack. He'd been H's best friend, a devoted grandpa, and more of a father to me than my own dad. We were all hit hard by the unexpected loss, and H began drinking more heavily than ever before. He became bedridden, and although he didn't admit it, his health was failing fast. The years of poisoning and alcoholism had taken their toll on his body. He couldn't heal with his constant smoking and booze intake. I begged him to stop drinking and take care of himself, for my sake and the kids. I was still deeply in love with him and I didn't want to lose another person. Finally, he promised that if we could move away to a new place that wasn't so full of traumatic memories, that he would stop drinking and we could make a new start. I agreed and found a place and moved us to a small country house a couple hours away. Gosh, earlier in the story, Aimie describes how when H's drinking problem really began in earnest, how he'd always been able to control himself before and then suddenly couldn't. And I can't help but wonder if it's because that evil neighbor was lacing his alcohol with other addictive substances like opiates, etc. This story is so dark, so absolutely murdery. Alright, so they moved to a new house in the country. H was still bedridden and couldn't walk, so Aimie did absolutely everything to get him and the family to the new house. A week after he arrived, he announced that it was time and that he would stop drinking. He did, and within 12 hours, his whole body was trembling. He would try to eat, but every time he'd vomit it back up within a few minutes. I was scared of what was happening, but in my mind, the mind that had been trained in submission since birth, I was also too scared to go against his wishes and take him to a doctor. I might mention here that I was deeply codependent, and that on some level I too brought his denial into the surrounding situation. And then, around 11 o'clock that night, the kids were asleep on the couch in the next room, and suddenly H got up out of bed and began to walk. I assumed he needed to go to the bathroom, so I jumped up to help him like I always did, but this time was different. He was walking like a robot. Almost immediately he fell, but continued toward the bathroom, now crawling in the same robotic fashion. I began to cry and ask him to stop, just let me help him, but he couldn't hear me. I quickly realized he was having a seizure as he rolled to his side and kept pumping his arms and legs uncontrollably. He began foaming at the mouth, with his jaw clenched so tightly that I couldn't fit my finger in to check for obstructions in his throat. I was frozen for a moment, but then quickly dialed 131, that's the ambulance here in Chile, on my phone. I was screaming at H and screaming into the phone, trying to give directions to our remote location and begging him to stay with me. After what seemed like an eternity, H's muscles relaxed, his head dropped, he sighed, and he was gone. Wow. Between screaming and crying and still talking to the ambulance dispatch, I remembered the kids. They were somehow miraculously still asleep in the next room. It tore my heart into little pieces of thinking to have to tell them that their daddy had just died. Something ignited inside me and I set to work doing chest compressions, chest compressions, chest compressions. I could hear his ribs breaking, but I didn't stop. And finally, after yet another eternity, his eyes flashed open and he asked me, "What are you doing?" I've never felt so relieved in my life. But it was soon apparent that he was hallucinating. Thankfully, the ambulance arrived within minutes, and for the first time in forever, there were brave men in charge. For the next week, H was in the hospital. At times, the doctors gently explained the reality to me, that his chances of survival were slim. I kept watch by his bed, translating his needs to doctors and nurses, hardly eating, and finally collapsing into a pile of tears when I just couldn't go anymore. This was when my rainbow appeared. My brothers and sisters, who were all about 6,000 miles away, but who became my emotional lifeline and reminded me to take care of myself and let the doctors do their job. While seeing H for the first time as who he really was, I simultaneously got to see the beauty of human love in 1,000 different ways. My taxi driver friend came to drop off my truck in the hospital parking lot after I killed the battery charging my phone. A friend's stepson gave me the keys to his house so I could go there to eat and sleep in peace. Another friend kept our kids and took them on outings to the beach to keep their minds off things. And yet another friend who also drove a taxi gave me a ride for free on his day off when I needed to get back to the hospital quickly. A stranger got out of his car to pick up my phone when I dropped it on a crosswalk, despite the fact that I gave him the finger after he honked at me to try to point it out. Long story short, H survived. He earned the fame of not only being a giant drug-resistant gringo in the hospital, but also being a survivor who beat all the odds. It was over the next 4 months of him being sober for the first time in years that I realized who he really was and that our relationship didn't work anymore. I don't like telling all the details, but despite all of my efforts to save us, it simply wasn't possible. Again, I had to find a way out of a situation that had become oppressive. Soon, I came up with a plan. Trembling and terrified as I did so, I began to look for prefab houses online. I had a small piece of land that my father-in-law had gifted me before his death, and I planned on building a house there for myself. My uncle, my mom's brother, not the psycho pastor whose son was a child molester, had recently gifted each of us 5 siblings with a sum of money, which would be sufficient for me to finance construction. Soon I'd met with a construction crew, 4 guys about my age who would be able to complete the mission. We signed a contract, and H still had no clue what was going on. My relationship was quickly going even further downhill, so one night, after choice words were exchanged, I grabbed a few things and headed out with the kids in my Toyota pickup. At this point, the construction had only recently begun, but due to a recent housing shortage, I had nowhere else to go. So, I called my construction boss and told him that I'd be arriving shortly. It was a 2-hour drive in the middle of the night while my truck was making noises and grated on my already shattered nerves. Finally, we arrived. There was a blazing campfire, food for the kids, and a tent set up for us. I didn't have the words to describe what had happened or why, but the guys made it clear that they supported me 100% and would make the situation work. Until the house was finished a short month and a half later, I stayed there camping. There was no better therapy for me than arriving at the end of the day to make a fire and cook over the coals, listening to Pink Floyd and rancheras on a cheap battery-powered speaker, living like a bunch of hippies and sharing everything alike between us. For once in my life, I didn't have to take care of everyone else. Wow. Oh my gosh, Aimie. I mean, the things that you have been through. All right. Aimie writes, I guess that's about everything up till now. Of course, the builders couldn't stay forever, and the kids and I now live on our own in our new home. It's not easy living isolated, but I feel like the silence and the solitude is worth the hardship. I ended up selling my truck and buying a boat, which I used to cross the river to get to the city. It's an adventurous life, and though sometimes it gets the best of me, I couldn't be happier. 6 months ago, I started going out with a local gent who's been truly wonderful to me. We're doing well, and I'm slowly getting used to having a partner who doesn't need me to care for him, enjoys his own space, and actively foments healthy communication. Thank you for offering the opportunity to share my story. I'm sure you get lots of emails, and I hope this hasn't been too much all at once. Even the process of writing it out has been incredibly cathartic, so thank you for that as well. Thanks again for your show. I really enjoy it. Sending my best to you and yours, Aimie. Holy moly. That is an absolutely incredible, insane story. And what Aimie has to say about the ultimate triumph of her own spirit and by extension the human spirit is just incredibly moving. At times this was a pretty tough episode to record because as I was telling Amy's story, I kept getting choked up. I'm sure you could hear it. Anyway, wow. Aimie, you're incredibly strong. This also seems like an appropriate spot to remind you all, as I often do. I wish I knew what the equivalent phone number was in Chile. Maybe Aimie can help us out with that, but please do remember, program it into your phone, the 3-digit lifeline number 988 that you can call anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to receive immediate counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. So if you find yourself in crisis, please do dial 988. But if you're not in crisis and you'd just like to connect with someone, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. There are many kinds of struggles in this world. Shout out to my fellow disabled people. As you know, I myself have cerebral palsy, and I want our community to be a place where everyone who faces a unique challenge, physical or otherwise, can check in as Aimie did and share their stories so that we can all become a little more real to each other and we can build empathy that way. Man, this is an incredible tale. But as I said at the start, everyone, I hope that today can just be the first of many listener stories episodes. So please, if you have an incredible true story from your own life to tell and you're willing to share it with the community, please do reach out to me. Again, that's kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. I would absolutely love to hear from you. And of course, you can still reach out to me even if you don't want me to share your story too. But please do connect with me. And also, please do make sure to subscribe to the show on whatever platform you use if you enjoy listening. And if you don't mind taking a moment to leave me a 5-star review, I would really appreciate that too. All right. I look forward to spending time with you all again this coming Thursday, January 12th. But until then, I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.